In 1987, three night shift nurses walked through the doors of St. Catherine's Hospital in Portland, Oregon, and were never seen again. No bodies, no witnesses, no explanation. But 35 years later, a construction crew demolishing the hospital's abandoned East Wing discovered something sealed behind the walls that would rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about that October night. This is the story of the vanishing, the decades of silence, and the horrifying truth that some secrets refuse to stay buried. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime investigations, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The photograph sat in a cardboard evidence box in the Portland Police Department's cold case archive. Its colors faded to sepia tones. Three women in pale blue nursing uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder outside St. Catherine's Hospital, their faces caught mid-laugh by an unknown photographer on an autumn afternoon in 1987. Patricia Moorhouse, 32, stood on the left, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her smile wide and genuine. Beside her was Carmen Reyes, 28, petite and animated, her hands frozen in mid-gesture as she told some story the camera had interrupted. On the right stood Denise Fletcher, 41, the eldest of the three, her expression softer, more reserved, but no less warm. They had been friends, colleagues, members of the same night shift rotation in the intensive care unit. They had shared coffee in the break room, traded shifts when family emergencies arose, and celebrated birthdays with grocery store cake, eaten hurriedly between patient rounds. They were ordinary women living ordinary lives, notable only for their dedication to caring for the sick and dying during the lonely hours between midnight and dawn. On October 23, 1987, all three reported for their regular night shift at St. Catherine's Hospital. Security logs showed them signing in at the nurses' station at 11:47 p.m. At 3:15 a.m., another nurse on the same floor reported seeing Patricia walking toward the East Wing stairwell, carrying what appeared to be medical supplies. That was the last confirmed sighting of any of the three women. When the day shift arrived at 7 o'clock that morning, Patricia, Carmen, and Denise were gone. Their personal belongings remained in their lockers. Their cars sat untouched in the employee parking lot. Their patients, some critical, had been left unattended for hours. It was as if the three women had simply ceased to exist, somewhere between the fluorescent-lit corridors and the sterile examination rooms of St. Catherine's Hospital. The investigation that followed was extensive, but yielded nothing. No evidence of foul play, no ransom demands, no sightings, no leads, no closure. The families held vigils, posted flyers, hired private investigators, and slowly, painfully, learned to live with unanswered questions. The hospital administration implemented new security protocols. The media coverage faded. The case went cold. 35 years passed. St. Catherine's Hospital closed its doors in 2019, a victim of budget cuts and consolidation. The building stood empty, its windows dark, its hallways silent, waiting for demolition. And then, in the autumn of 2022, construction workers breaking down the East Wing's third floor discovered something that would bring Detective Sarah Chen to the abandoned hospital on a morning when the October fog rolled thick through the streets of Portland, obscuring everything except the truth that had been waiting all along. The call came through to Detective Sarah Chen's desk at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning, just as she was finishing her second cup of coffee and reviewing case files from the previous night's arrests. She recognized the voice immediately, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her direct superior, a man who rarely called unless something significant had emerged. "Chen, I need you at St. Catherine's Hospital," he said without preamble. "The old one," The one they're tearing down on Morrison Street. Sarah set down her coffee, reaching automatically for her notebook. What have we got? Construction crew found something in the east wing. Third floor, sealed behind a wall. Webb paused, and Sarah heard the tension in his silence. Sarah, it might be related to the 1987 disappearances. The 3 nurses. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had read the file on the Moorhouse Reyes Fletcher case during her first month with the cold case unit 3 years earlier. It was one of those investigations that haunted detectives across decades, the kind where every theory led nowhere and every lead dissolved into dead ends. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, Sarah pulled her unmarked sedan up to the chain-link fence surrounding the hospital property. Construction vehicles and equipment crowded the parking lot, but the work had clearly stopped. Yellow police tape cordoned off the main entrance, and 2 uniformed officers stood guard, their breath visible in the October morning chill. She showed her badge and signed in, then followed one of the officers through the building's front doors. The interior of St. Catherine's was a study in decay. Ceiling tiles hung loose or had fallen entirely, exposing ductwork and wiring. The linoleum floors were scuffed and stained, scattered with debris from 3 years of abandonment. The air smelled of mold and something else, something organic and unpleasant, that Sarah didn't want to identify. They climbed the east wing stairwell, their footsteps echoing in the empty shaft. On the 3rd floor, Sarah saw the evidence team had already arrived. Portable lights illuminated a section of hallway where the wall had been partially demolished, revealing a small space that shouldn't have existed according to any architectural plans. Lieutenant Webb stood near the opening, speaking with the medical examiner. He turned as Sarah approached, his expression grim. "Chen, good." Dr. Morrison was just explaining what they found. The medical examiner, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, nodded in greeting. "Detective, I won't have official findings until after the autopsy, but I can give you preliminary observations." She gestured toward the opening in the wall. 3 bodies, both female. Advanced decomposition, but the sealed environment preserved more than you'd expect. After 35 years, they were placed in that space deliberately. Then the wall was reconstructed to hide them. Sarah moved closer to the opening, careful not to disturb the evidence markers. Through the gap, she could see what appeared to be a narrow maintenance space, perhaps 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. The bodies lay together, partially skeletal, clothed in what looked like pale blue fabric. "Nursing uniforms?" Sarah asked quietly. "That's my assessment," Dr. Morrison replied. "We found identification in the pockets, hospital ID badges for Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher." Sarah felt the weight of those names. 3 women who had walked into this building, expecting to care for patients and comfort the suffering, never imagining they would become victims themselves. Cause of death? Too early to say definitively. No obvious signs of trauma to the bones. But that doesn't rule out soft tissue injuries, strangulation, poisoning, or other methods that wouldn't leave skeletal marks. "I'll know more after the full examination." Dr. Morrison paused, then added, "But there's something else you need to see." She led Sarah to an evidence table, where several items had been carefully laid out and photographed. Among them was a small notebook, its pages yellowed and water-stained, but still partially legible. "We found this with the bodies. It appears to be a diary or journal, kept by one of the victims." Sarah leaned in, studying the faded handwriting visible on the open page. The words were cramped and hurried, written by someone in distress. She could make out fragments. "Won't let us leave. Knows we saw. Has to keep us quiet. We're treating this as a triple homicide. Webb said, moving to stand beside Sarah. 35 years cold, but still an open case. I want you as lead detective. Pull whatever resources you need. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the implications. Someone had murdered 3 nurses and concealed their bodies within the hospital itself, then lived with that secret for more than 3 decades. Do we know who was working construction? Who actually broke through the wall? Foreman's name is Rick Paulson. He and his crew are waiting downstairs. I told them nobody leaves until we get statements. Webb handed Sarah a folder. This is everything we have from the original investigation. Interviews, timelines, security logs. It's all there. Sarah accepted the folder, feeling its weight. Somewhere in those yellowed pages and faded reports was a thread that had been missed, a detail that could lead her to whoever had sealed 3 women behind a hospital wall and left them to be forgotten. She turned back to the opening, watching as the evidence technicians carefully documented every aspect of the scene. They deserve better than this, she said quietly, more to herself than to Webb or Dr. Morrison. They deserved better than to disappear and be forgotten. Then, let's make sure they're not forgotten anymore, Webb replied. Find out who did this, Chen. These women and their families have waited long enough for answers. Sarah pulled out her phone and began photographing the scene from multiple angles, being careful not to interfere with the official evidence collection. As she worked, she noticed something the others might have missed. On the interior wall of the hidden space, barely visible beneath decades of dust, were marks, scratches, deep gouges in the plaster that could only have been made by fingernails scraping desperately at the surface. Her stomach tightened as she understood what she was seeing. The 3 nurses hadn't been dead when they were placed in that space. They had been alive, sealed behind the wall, and had died slowly in the darkness, clawing at the plaster as they suffocated or succumbed to dehydration. This wasn't just murder. This was something far worse. The construction foreman, Rick Paulson, sat in what had once been the hospital's administrative office, now stripped bare, except for a folding table and several chairs the police had brought in for interviews. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, his face weathered from years of outdoor work, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a styrofoam cup of coffee. Sarah sat across from him, her notebook open, her expression neutral but attentive. Beside her sat Detective James Kowalski, her partner in the cold case unit, a veteran investigator with 23 years on the force, and the patient demeanor of someone who had learned that silence often extracted more truth than questions. Mr. Paulson, Sarah began, her voice gentle. I know this has been a shock. Just tell me what happened this morning, in your own words. Paulson nodded, swallowing hard. We started demo work on the 3rd floor east wing around 6 this morning. That section was slated for complete teardown, so we were pulling down the interior walls with a small excavator. My guy, Danny, was operating the machine, taking down a section of corridor wall, when the bucket punched through, and he saw there was a space behind it that wasn't on any of the blueprints. What did you do then? Sarah asked. Danny stopped immediately and called me over. I looked through the hole and saw what appeared to be fabric, maybe clothing. At first, I thought it might be old storage, stuff left behind when the hospital closed. But then I saw the shape, the way things were positioned, and I realized we were looking at human remains. Paulson set down his coffee cup, his hands still shaking. I've been in construction for 30 years, Detective. I've seen a lot of strange things in old buildings, but I've never seen anything like this. Did you touch anything? Move anything? Kowalski asked. No, sir. As soon as I realized what we had, I ordered everyone off that floor and called 911. We've been down here ever since, waiting. Sarah made notes, then looked up at Paulson. The hospital has been closed since 2019. Has your crew been working here the whole time? Are you familiar with the building? We only started this project 2 weeks ago. Before that, the building sat empty. City finally sold it to a development company that wants to put up condos. Our job is to tear down everything except the main structures and foundation. In those 2 weeks, did you or your crew notice anything unusual? Anyone who shouldn't be here? Signs that someone might have been accessing the building? Paulson considered this. There's evidence of homeless people using the lower floors. You find that in any abandoned building, but nothing that seemed connected to what we found today. The east wing 3rd floor was sealed up tight. That wall we broke through this morning. It looked original. Professional construction matched everything around it. Sarah exchanged a glance with Kowalski. Whoever had sealed the bodies behind that wall had done it skillfully, making the modification blend seamlessly with the existing structure. That suggested someone with construction knowledge or access to hospital maintenance staff. I'll need contact information for everyone on your crew, she said. Just routine, so we can establish the timeline clearly. Of course. Whatever you need. Paulson pulled a work roster from his jacket pocket and handed it to Sarah. There are 8 of us total. Good men, all of them. Been working together for years. Sarah took the roster and stood. Thank you, Mr. Paulson. We may have more questions later, but for now, you and your crew are free to go. The site will remain closed pending our investigation. After Paulson left, Sarah and Kowalski walked back through the hospital's empty corridors toward the 3rd floor. The building felt different now that Sarah knew what it contained. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. This place had been built to heal, but somewhere within its walls, something terrible had happened. What are you thinking? Kowalski asked as they climbed the stairs. I'm thinking whoever did this had intimate knowledge of the hospital, access to the 3rd floor in the middle of the night, construction skills to rebuild the wall, and the confidence that the bodies wouldn't be found. Sarah paused on the landing between floors. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. Someone who worked here, Kowalski said. It wasn't a question. Someone who worked here, Sarah confirmed, and who might still be alive. They reached the 3rd floor and found the evidence team still processing the scene. Dr. Morrison had left to transport the remains to the medical examiner's office, but the space behind the wall remained fully lit, every detail now visible and documented. Sarah stood at the opening, looking at the scratches on the interior wall, imagining the terror those 3 women must have felt. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Webb. Family notifications complete. Patricia Moorhouse's daughter wants to speak with you. Contact info attached. Sarah read the message twice. Patricia Moorhouse's daughter. That meant someone had grown up without a mother, had spent 35 years wondering and grieving, and was now about to learn the horrible truth about how her mother had died. Sarah typed a response, confirming she would make the call, then pocketed her phone. Let's go back to the station, she said to Kowalski. I want to review every interview from the original investigation. Every person who worked at this hospital in 1987. Someone knows what happened that night, and we're going to find them. As they descended the stairs and emerged into the October daylight, Sarah couldn't shake the image of those scratch marks on the wall. 3 women trapped in darkness, knowing they were going to die, fighting until their last breath against the inevitable. Whoever had done this to them had lived freely for 35 years. That was about to end. The morning fog had lifted, but the day remained overcast. the sun hidden behind thick clouds. Sarah climbed into her sedan and sat for a moment before starting the engine, collecting her thoughts, preparing herself for what lay ahead. This case would consume her, she knew. It would infiltrate her dreams and shadow her waking hours until she found the truth. But that was the job. That was what she had signed up for when she joined the cold case unit, knowing that some mysteries were decades old, but no less urgent, no less deserving of justice. Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher had been waiting 35 years for someone to tell their story. Sarah Chen intended to be that someone. The interview room at the Portland Police Department was designed to be neutral and calming, painted in soft beige tones, with comfortable chairs and a table that bore none of the intimidating weight of interrogation furniture. Sarah sat across from Jennifer Moorhouse Palmer, who at 43 years old bore a striking resemblance to her mother in the faded photograph from 1987. The same dark hair, though Jennifer wore hers shorter. The same warm eyes, though these were rimmed with red from crying. Jennifer's husband, Michael Palmer, sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Between them on the table sat a box of tissues already half empty and a water bottle Jennifer hadn't touched. "Thank you for coming in," Sarah said gently. "I know this is impossibly difficult. I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to find out what happened to your mother." Jennifer nodded, wiping at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "I was 8 years old when she disappeared. For 35 years, I've wondered if she was alive somewhere, if maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown and just walked away from her life. Part of me always hoped I'd get a phone call one day, that she'd explain everything." Her voice broke. "But now, I know she was there the whole time, in that hospital, and nobody found her." Sarah let the silence sit for a moment, allowing Jennifer space for her grief. "I've been reading through the original investigation files. Your mother was devoted to you. Every person interviewed mentioned how often she talked about her daughter, how proud she was of you." "She was supposed to have the weekend off," Jennifer said, her voice distant with memory. "But one of the other nurses called in sick, and Mom agreed to take the shift. She always did that, always helped when someone needed her. She called me that evening before she left for work, told me she'd take me to the zoo on Monday, when she had her next day off." Jennifer looked up at Sarah, her eyes desperate. "Did she suffer? Please tell me she didn't suffer." Sarah wished she could offer comfort, but honesty mattered more. "The medical examiner is still conducting tests. I promise you'll know everything we learn, as soon as we learn it." Michael spoke for the first time, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Do you have any suspects? Any idea who could have done this? We're in the early stages of investigation, but I need to ask you both some questions about the time surrounding your mother's disappearance. Jennifer, do you remember if your mother mentioned anything unusual happening at the hospital in the days or weeks before October 23rd? Jennifer thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She mentioned a patient once. I remember because it was unusual for her to talk about work at home. She kept her professional life very separate. But there was this patient she seemed worried about, someone in the ICU who was dying. She said something about the family being difficult, making accusations." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. "Do you remember any names? Any specific details?" "No, I was only 8. I just remember her seeming stressed about it, more than usual." Jennifer paused, then added, "Wait, there was something else. The day before she disappeared, she called my grandmother, her mother. I answered the phone and heard part of the conversation. Mom said something like, I need to talk to you about something important, but not over the phone. She sounded upset. Did she ever have that conversation with your grandmother? Jennifer shook her head. Grandma passed away in 1995. She never stopped looking for Mom. It broke her heart. Sarah made detailed notes, underlining the reference to the difficult family and the urgent need to speak with her mother. Jennifer, did the police ever talk to you about your mother's personal life? Was she seeing anyone? Did she have any conflicts with anyone you knew about? My parents were divorced. Dad had remarried and moved to Seattle. Mom wasn't dating anyone that I knew of. She was focused on work and on raising me. We were happy. Jennifer's voice cracked again. We were supposed to go to the zoo. Sarah reached across the table and gently touched Jennifer's hand. Your mother loved you very much. That's clear in every document I've read. Whatever happened to her, it wasn't because she wanted to leave you. I need you to hold on to that. After Jennifer and Michael left, Sarah returned to her desk, where Kowalski had spread out 3 decades worth of case files across every available surface. He looked up as she entered, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a legal pad covered in his distinctive scrawling handwriting. Find anything? Sarah asked, shedding her jacket and reaching for the nearest stack of interview transcripts. Maybe. October 1987. There was a patient death in the ICU that resulted in a complaint filed against the hospital. Family claimed negligence. The patient's name was Robert Whitmore, 62 years old, died of complications from heart surgery. Kowalski tapped his legal pad. The family was convinced the nursing staff had made a medication error that contributed to his death. Patricia Moorhouse was one of the nurses named in the complaint. Sarah felt a pulse of recognition. Jennifer mentioned her mother being stressed about a difficult family. Could be connected. Hospital administration investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The complaint was dismissed. But get this, Robert Whitmore's son threatened legal action. There are notes in the file about him becoming aggressive with staff, having to be escorted from the hospital by security. Kowalski pulled out a photocopy of an incident report. His name is David Whitmore. Still lives in Portland. Sarah took the report and scanned it quickly. David Whitmore had confronted Patricia Moorhouse directly 3 days before her disappearance, accusing her of murdering his father. Security had intervened and banned him from the hospital premises. We need to talk to him. Already got his address. He's 59 now. Works as an accountant downtown. Kowalski removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. But Sarah, even if he had motive to go after Patricia, why kill the other 2 nurses? Carmen Reyes and Denise Fletcher weren't named in the complaint. Maybe they witnessed something? Maybe they knew something. Sarah sat down at her desk, pulling up the hospital employee records on her computer. Or maybe this isn't about the Whitmore death at all. Maybe that's just one thread in something bigger. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Kowalski built a timeline on the whiteboard in their office. The 3 nurses had clocked in together at 11:47 p.m. on October 23rd. Security footage from the parking lot, grainy but still preserved in the evidence files, showed them arriving in separate vehicles. Patricia had stopped at the nurses' station to review patient charts. Carmen had gone directly to the ICU to check on her assigned patients. Denise had visited the medication dispensary. At 3:15 a.m., Patricia had been seen heading toward the East Wing stairwell. After that, nothing. No witness statements, no security camera footage from the East Wing, no sign of the 3 women, until their bodies were discovered 35 years later behind a wall. Sarah stood in front of the timeline, marker in hand, staring at that gap. 4 hours between the last sighting and when they should have clocked out. 4 hours when 3 women had disappeared from a hospital full of people. How does that happen? She asked aloud. How do 3 nurses vanish from their workplace without anyone noticing until shift change? Kowalski joined her at the whiteboard. The night shift is always understaffed. Fewer people around. The East Wing 3rd floor housed long-term care patients at the time. People who were stable, not requiring intensive monitoring. It's possible nobody went to that section of the floor for hours. But the bodies were found behind a wall. Building that wall, even a temporary partition, would take time, would make noise. Sarah circled the 3:15 a.m. notation. Whoever did this had to subdue 3 women, get them into that space, and seal them in, all without attracting attention. Unless, Kowalski said slowly, they had help, or they were someone nobody would question seeing in that part of the hospital at that hour. Sarah turned to look at him. Hospital maintenance. They'd have access to construction materials, tools. They'd be familiar with the building's layout. And nobody would think twice about seeing a maintenance worker in the hallways at 3 in the morning. Time to pull the employee records, Kowalski said, already moving toward his desk. Every maintenance worker, security guard, and janitor who was on duty that night. The Portland Police Department's records room occupied the basement level of the building, a climate-controlled archive of 3 decades' worth of case files, evidence logs, and administrative documents. Sarah descended the narrow stairs with Kowalski following behind, both of them carrying empty boxes to transport the materials they needed. The clerk on duty, an elderly man named Howard, who had worked in records longer than Sarah had been alive, looked up from his crossword puzzle as they approached his desk. Let me guess. The St. Catherine's case? Word travels fast, Sarah said. You're the 3rd detective down here today, asking for those files. Lieutenant Webb was here this morning, and Garcia from robbery wanted to cross-reference some old burglary reports with the hospital. Howard set down his pencil and pushed his rolling chair toward a row of filing cabinets. I pulled everything related to St. Catherine's Hospital, 1987. Personnel records, security logs, incident reports. It's all in boxes 12 through 18 on the 3rd shelf. Sarah and Kowalski spent the next hour transporting boxes to a work table and methodically sorting through decades-old documents. The hospital had employed over 200 people in 1987, from surgeons and administrators to cafeteria workers and cleaning staff. The night shift on October 23rd had included 37 employees across all departments. Here's the maintenance roster, Kowalski said, spreading several pages across the table. 6 people assigned to night maintenance, 2 general maintenance workers, 1 electrician, 1 plumber, 2 custodians. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, scanning the names. Most had been interviewed during the original investigation, their statements filed away, and apparently unremarkable enough that no follow-up had been warranted. But one name caught her attention, not because it appeared on the maintenance roster, but because it didn't appear anywhere at all in the investigation files. Thomas Brennan, she said, pointing to the 3rd name on the list. Head of night maintenance. Why don't I see an interview report for him? Kowalski flipped through the stack of witness statements. You're right. Every other person on duty that night was interviewed within 48 hours of the disappearance. But there's no statement from Brennan. Sarah pulled out her phone and photographed the maintenance roster, then began searching through the other boxes for any mention of Thomas Brennan. She found his employment file, a thin folder containing a job application from 1982, performance reviews that were consistently positive, and an employment termination notice dated November 15, 1987, less than a month after the nurses disappeared. He quit, Sarah said, holding up the termination form. 2 weeks after the disappearance, he submitted his resignation, effective immediately. "That's not suspicious at all," Kowalski muttered, already pulling out his laptop to run a background check. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up databases and cross-referencing information. After several minutes, he shook his head. Thomas Brennan, DOB, April 12, 1951. Last known address in Portland, from 1987. After that, nothing. No credit cards, no mortgage, no utility bills. Either he's living completely off the grid, or he's dead. Or he changed his identity. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Lieutenant Webb. When he answered, she could hear traffic noise in the background. "Lieutenant, I need you to authorize a full search for Thomas Brennan, former head of night maintenance at St. Catherine's. He resigned 2 weeks after the nurses disappeared and was never interviewed during the original investigation." "Never interviewed?" Webb's voice sharpened. "How did that slip through?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. But I want to find him. If he's alive, I want to know why he ran." "You've got authorization for whatever you need. Keep me updated." Sarah ended the call and turned back to the documents spread across the table. Something had been missed in 1987, some crucial detail that had allowed Thomas Brennan to slip away unquestioned. She began reading through the original detective's notes, looking for any reference to maintenance staff. What she found made her blood run cold. The lead detective in 1987 had been a man named Frank Harrigan, now retired and living in Arizona, according to the departmental directory. His notes were meticulous, documenting every interview, every lead pursued, every dead end encountered. But there was a single line, dated October 26th, 3 days after the disappearance. "T. Brennan unavailable for interview. Out sick. Will follow up." There was no follow-up note, no indication that Harrigan had ever spoken to Brennan. And 2 weeks later, Brennan had resigned and vanished. "I want to talk to Harrigan," Sarah said. "He's the one who let Brennan slip away. I need to know why." Kowalski nodded, making a note. "I'll track down his contact information in Arizona. Meanwhile, we should visit Brennan's last known address. Maybe someone there remembers him." They gathered the relevant documents and headed back upstairs. Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, constructing scenarios. Thomas Brennan had access to the East Wing, knowledge of the building's layout, and the skills to construct a false wall. He had disappeared from the investigation, despite being on duty, the night the nurses vanished, and he had fled Portland shortly after. The connections were too obvious to ignore. But Sarah had learned through years of investigative work that obvious didn't always mean correct. Sometimes the person who looked most guilty was a convenient scapegoat, while the real killer hid in plain sight. Back at her desk, Sarah found a message waiting from Dr. Morrison. The preliminary autopsy results were ready. She called the medical examiner's office and was put through immediately. "Detective Chen," Dr. Morrison's voice was grave. "I have findings you need to hear in person. Can you come to the morgue?" "I'm on my way." The medical examiner's office was located in a separate building 3 blocks from police headquarters. Sarah made the walk quickly, her breath visible in the October cold. The receptionist waved her through to the examination rooms, where Dr. Morrison waited in her office, a thick file folder open on her desk. "The remains have been positively identified through dental records," Dr. Morrison began, without preamble. "Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher. But the cause of death isn't what we initially suspected." Sarah leaned forward. "What did you find?" "All 3 women show evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Depressed fractures consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. They were dead or dying, before they were placed behind that wall. Dr. Morrison pulled out a series of X-rays and laid them on her desk. But here's what's interesting. The pattern of injuries suggests they were killed separately at different times. Different times? Sarah studied the X-rays, though she lacked the expertise to interpret what she was seeing. How different? Patricia Moorhouse's injuries show more advanced healing, suggesting she survived for perhaps several hours after the initial assault. Carmen Reyes and Denise Fletcher died more quickly, minutes rather than hours. Dr. Morrison pointed to specific areas on the X-rays. It's as if someone attacked them one at a time, over a period of hours, rather than all at once. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. So, one nurse was killed, then another, then another. They might have known what was happening, might have tried to hide or run. That's consistent with the evidence. We also found defensive wounds on Carmen Reyes's hands and arms. She fought back. Dr. Morrison closed the file folder. There's one more thing. We found trace evidence under the fingernails of all three victims, skin cells, possibly from their attacker. I've sent samples to the lab for DNA analysis. If we find a match in the database, we'll have our killer. Sarah stood, her mind already moving to the next steps. How long for the DNA results? Rush priority, 48 to 72 hours. I've explained the circumstances, the age of the case. They're making it a priority. Thank you, Doctor. Sarah paused at the door. Those scratch marks on the wall, the ones we found in the sealed space. If the women were already dead, who made those marks? Dr. Morrison met her eyes. That's the question that's been troubling me as well, Detective. Either someone was sealed in that space alive and managed to survive long enough to try to claw their way out, or someone wanted us to think that's what happened. But I can tell you with certainty that none of the three nurses we recovered could have made those marks. They were dead before the wall was built. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she walked back to her car. If Patricia, Carmen, and Denise hadn't made the scratch marks, then who had? Was there a fourth victim, someone whose body had been removed before the construction crew broke through the wall? Or had the killer scratched the wall himself, creating a horrifying tableau designed to traumatize whoever eventually discovered the bodies? She drove back to the station slowly, her thoughts dark and troubled. This case was revealing itself in layers, each one more disturbing than the last. 3 women had been murdered over the course of several hours in a hospital full of people. They had been sealed behind a wall, hidden for 35 years. And now, evidence suggested there might be more to the story, details still buried and waiting to be uncovered. Her phone rang. Kowalski's name appeared on the screen. I found something, he said when she answered. Thomas Brennan's last known address was an apartment building on Stark Street. The building's still there. I called the current landlord. The previous owner kept tenant records going back 40 years. Brennan's file is in storage, and the landlord is willing to let us look at it. I'm 5 minutes away, Sarah said. Meet me there. The apartment building on Stark Street had seen better days. Built sometime in the 1960s, the 3-story structure showed its age in cracked concrete steps and faded paint that might once have been yellow, but had weathered to a dingy beige. Sarah parked behind Kowalski's vehicle and found him waiting by the entrance, speaking with a man in his 70s, who held a ring of keys and a manila folder. Detective Chen, this is Harold Morse. He's owned the building since 2003, Kowalski said, making introductions. Morse shook Sarah's hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. I bought the place from the previous owner's estate. Part of the sale included all the old tenant records going back to when the building opened. I keep meaning to digitize everything, but time gets away from you. He held up the manila folder. This is Thomas Brennan's file. Moved in January 1982. Moved out November 1987. May we see it? Sarah asked. Morse handed her the folder, and Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of Brennan's original rental application, several rent receipts, and a handwritten note on faded stationery. The rental application showed a man in his early 30s, listing his occupation as hospital maintenance worker, his previous address in Eugene, Oregon, and 2 references, both of which appeared to be former employers. But it was the handwritten note that caught Sarah's attention. Dated November 20th, 1987, it was written on letterhead from St. Catherine's Hospital. To whom it may concern, Thomas Brennan has been a reliable tenant for 5 years. His rent has always been paid on time, and he has caused no disturbances. He is vacating the premises due to personal reasons and has fulfilled all lease obligations. I am holding his security deposit in escrow, as per his request, to be mailed to a forwarding address when he provides one. To date, no forwarding address has been received. The note was signed by the building's previous landlord, a man named Peter Gallagher. Brennan never came back for his security deposit? Sarah asked. Morse shook his head. According to the records, no. Gallagher held it for 7 years, as required by law. Then it went to the state's unclaimed property division. Brennan just disappeared. Can we see the apartment? Kowalski asked. It's been rented continuously since 1987. Current tenant is a college student who won't be home until later, but I can let you look around if you're quiet about it. Morse led them inside and up 2 flights of stairs to apartment 3B. He knocked firmly on the door, waited, then unlocked it when no one answered. Make it quick. I don't want complaints. The apartment was small, a studio with a kitchenette, bathroom, and a single room that served as both bedroom and living space. The current tenant had decorated with posters and string lights, textbooks stacked on a desk beneath the window. But Sarah wasn't interested in the present occupant. She was trying to imagine Thomas Brennan living here 35 years ago, trying to understand what kind of man he had been. Kowalski photographed the layout, while Sarah examined the space. The walls were thin, the windows overlooked the street, and the apartment felt temporary, like a place someone might live while saving money or planning their next move. Nothing here suggested permanence or the kind of roots that would make leaving difficult. Thank you, Mr. Morse, Sarah said. After several minutes, this has been helpful. If we need anything else, we'll be in touch. Back outside, standing beside their cars in the October afternoon light, Kowalski pulled out his notebook. So, Brennan lives here for 5 years, works at the hospital, has no complaints from neighbors. Then 3 nurses disappear, and 2 weeks later, he's gone. Never comes back, never collects his deposit, just vanishes. Someone helped him, Sarah said. You don't disappear that completely without help. New identity, new social security number. Someone who could make Thomas Brennan cease to exist. Federal witness protection? Sarah shook her head. Then there would be records, however sealed. This is something else. Something unofficial. She pulled out her phone and dialed Lieutenant Webb. When he answered, she said, I need authorization to contact Frank Harrigan in Arizona. He was the lead detective in 1987, and I have questions about why Thomas Brennan was never interviewed. You think Harrigan covered for him? I think Harrigan might know why Brennan disappeared, and why nobody followed up. Whether he covered for him, or just made a mistake. I need to find out which. You have authorization. But Chen, be diplomatic. Harrigan put in 30 years with the department. He's got friends here. Understood. Sarah ended the call and turned to Kowalski. Let's split up. You track down everything you can find on Thomas Brennan before 1982. Where he grew up, where he went to school, family connections. I'm going to call Harrigan and see what he remembers. They parted ways, Kowalski heading back to the station, while Sarah drove to a coffee shop with reliable Wi-Fi. She ordered an Americano and settled into a corner booth, pulling out her laptop and the notes she'd taken from the case files. Frank Harrigan's contact information showed a Phoenix address and a phone number with an Arizona area code. She dialed, unsure what she would say, unsure whether Harrigan would even be willing to talk about a case that was decades old. The phone rang 4 times before a man's voice answered, rough and cautious. Harrigan? Mr. Harrigan, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Portland Police Department. I'm calling about the St. Catherine's Hospital case from 1987. The disappearance of Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher. There was a long pause. They found them. It wasn't a question. Somehow Harrigan already knew. Yes, sir. Their remains were discovered yesterday behind a wall in the hospital's east wing. We're reopening the investigation as a triple homicide. Another pause, longer this time. I knew it would come back eventually. I knew someone would find them. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Mr. Harrigan, that sounds like you knew where the bodies were. No, but I knew they were dead. I knew from the beginning they hadn't just walked away. His voice carried the weight of years, of guilt, of secrets kept too long. You want to know about Thomas Brennan? Yes, sir. He was never interviewed during your investigation, despite being on duty the night the nurses disappeared. 2 weeks later, he resigned and vanished. I need to understand why he was allowed to leave. I was told to let it go. Sarah's hand tightened on her phone. Told by whom? Hospital administration, specifically the hospital's chief counsel, a man named Richard Vance. He called me 3 days after the nurses disappeared and said that Thomas Brennan had information about certain irregularities at the hospital, financial discrepancies that had nothing to do with the missing nurses. He said Brennan was cooperating with an internal investigation and that questioning him about the nurses would compromise that investigation. And you believed him? I was a detective with 12 years on the force. I'd learned that sometimes you have to trust other people's investigations, especially when they involve institutional matters outside your jurisdiction. Harrigan's voice turned bitter. But I never stopped wondering. When Brennan resigned and disappeared, I tried to follow up. Vance told me Brennan had been cleared of any involvement in the nurse's disappearance and had relocated for personal reasons. The case went cold, and I moved on to other investigations. But I never forgot those 3 women. Sarah was writing quickly, filling pages of her notebook. Do you remember anything else about Thomas Brennan? Anything that seemed off about him? He was quiet, kept to himself. The few hospital employees who knew him said he was reliable, showed up for his shifts, did his job without complaint. But there was something about him that bothered me, even in those first few days. He reminded me of men I'd met in the military, the kind who had seen things they didn't talk about, who carried damage they'd learned to hide. Harrigan exhaled heavily. Detective Chen, I've lived with this case for 35 years. If Brennan killed those nurses, then I let him walk away. That's on me. Richard Vance, the hospital's counsel. Is he still alive? Last I heard, he was retired and living in Lake Oswego. But that was years ago. He'd be in his 80s by now. Sarah thanked Harrigan and ended the call. She sat in the coffee shop for several minutes, processing what she'd learned. The hospital administration had actively interfered with the investigation, had provided cover for a suspect to disappear. That suggested knowledge, possibly complicity. And it meant the answer to what happened on October 23rd, 1987, might lie not with a single killer, but with an institution that had protected its secrets at the cost of 3 women's lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kowalski. Found Brennan's military records. Served in Vietnam, 1969-1971. Honorable discharge. Get this. Awarded Bronze Star for valor. Also treated for PTSD at VA Hospital. In Eugene, 1972-1974. Sarah stared at the message. Thomas Brennan was a decorated veteran with documented trauma. That fit Harrigan's assessment of a man carrying damage. It also suggested someone capable of violence, someone trained to kill, someone who might have learned to compartmentalize horrific acts. But it didn't explain why the hospital would protect him. Unless there was something else, some other secret, that made Brennan valuable enough to shield from a murder investigation. She needed to talk to Richard Vance. Richard Vance lived in a sprawling ranch house on 3 acres of wooded property in Lake Oswego, one of Portland's affluent suburbs. Sarah and Kowalski arrived late in the afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. A silver Mercedes sat in the circular driveway, and smoke rose from the house's stone chimney. The door was answered by a woman in her 50s, well-dressed and immediately wary. "Can I help you?" Sarah showed her badge. "I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Kowalski. We're here to speak with Richard Vance about a case from 1987. Is he available?" The woman's wariness deepened. "I'm his daughter, Elizabeth. My father is elderly, and his health isn't good. What is this regarding?" "The disappearance of 3 nurses from St. Catherine's Hospital. It's urgent." Elizabeth hesitated, then stepped aside. "Wait in the living room. I'll see if he's up to talking." The living room was furnished expensively, with leather sofas and bookshelves lined with legal volumes. Framed photographs covered one wall, documenting a life of achievement. Vance shaking hands with governors and senators, Vance receiving awards, Vance surrounded by family at various celebrations. After several minutes, Elizabeth returned. "He'll speak with you, but I'm staying in the room. His memory isn't what it was, and I don't want him becoming confused or upset." She led them to a sunroom at the back of the house, where Richard Vance sat in a wheelchair, a blanket across his lap, despite the warmth from the fireplace. He was gaunt, his face marked by age and illness, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Detectives," he said, his voice thin but clear. "My daughter says you're here about St. Catherine's. About the nurses." "Yes, sir. Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher. Their bodies were discovered yesterday in the hospital's east wing." Sarah sat in a chair across from him, keeping her posture non-threatening, but professional. "We're reviewing the original investigation, and your name came up, in connection with Thomas Brennan." Something flickered in Vance's expression, there and gone too quickly to identify. "I haven't heard that name in many years." "You told the investigating detective in 1987 that Brennan was involved in an internal investigation regarding financial irregularities at the hospital. You asked that he not be questioned about the missing nurses. Did I?" Vance's eyes were steady. "I don't recall that conversation." "Mr. Vance," Kowalski said, his voice patient, "we have documentation. We've spoken with Frank Harrigan, the detective you contacted. He remembers the conversation clearly." "Frank Harrigan." Vance smiled slightly. "Yes, I remember Frank. A good detective. Too good in some ways." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. Vance looked at his daughter, then back at Sarah. It means he asked questions that were better left unasked. The hospital was facing multiple lawsuits in 1987. Malpractice claims, wrongful death suits, allegations of negligence. The board of directors was concerned about the institution's reputation, about maintaining public trust. When 3 nurses disappeared, it became a crisis that threatened to expose other problems. What kind of problems? The kind that hospitals in the 1980s preferred to handle internally. Medication discrepancies, equipment failures, deaths that occurred under questionable circumstances. Vance spoke carefully, choosing each word. Thomas Brennan had witnessed certain irregularities during his night shifts. He had come to me confidentially, seeking advice about what he should do. When the nurses disappeared, I was concerned that bringing Brennan into a murder investigation would compromise his willingness to cooperate with the internal review. Sarah leaned forward. Mr. Vance, 3 women were murdered and sealed behind a wall. Whatever internal problems the hospital was facing, they don't justify obstructing a murder investigation. I never obstructed anything, Vance said sharply, showing a flash of the lawyer he had once been. I asked for a brief delay in questioning one witness, that's all. A witness who subsequently disappeared and has never been found, Kowalski pointed out. A witness who might have been the killer. Or a witness who was frightened, Vance countered. Thomas Brennan was a troubled man. He had served his country, had been traumatized by what he experienced in Vietnam. He came to me because he trusted me, because I had helped him before with a personal matter. When the nurses disappeared, he was terrified he would be blamed. Why would he think he'd be blamed? Sarah asked. Vance was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where autumn leaves tumbled across the lawn. Because he had been involved with one of them, Patricia Moorhouse. They'd had a relationship, brief and secret. When she ended it, he didn't take it well. He knew how it would look. Sarah felt the case shift in her mind, pieces rearranging into new patterns. Did anyone else know about this relationship? Not that I'm aware of. Brennan told me about it when he came seeking advice about the hospital irregularities. He was worried that if his relationship with Patricia became known, anything he said about problems at the hospital would be dismissed as revenge or spite. Where is Thomas Brennan now? Kowalski asked. I don't know. After he resigned, he contacted me once, thanked me for my help, and said he was starting over somewhere else. I never heard from him again. Elizabeth Vance, who had been standing silently near the door, spoke for the first time. Dad, you need to rest. This is too much for you. But Vance ignored her, his eyes fixed on Sarah. Detective, I made choices in 1987 that I believed were in the best interest of the hospital and the people it served. If those choices allowed a killer to escape justice, I will have to answer for that in whatever judgment awaits me. But I never knew for certain that Thomas Brennan killed those nurses. I still don't. The DNA evidence we recovered from the victims will tell us, Sarah said, standing. If Brennan's DNA is in the system, we'll know within 48 hours. She and Kowalski left the Vance house and sat in their car for several minutes, both processing what they'd learned. The case was becoming more complex, layered with institutional corruption and personal relationships that had been hidden for decades. If Brennan and Patricia Moorhouse had a relationship that ended badly, that's motive, Kowalski said. But why kill the other 2 nurses? Maybe they knew about the relationship. Maybe Patricia had confided in them. Sarah started the engine. Or maybe the relationship is a red herring. Vance could be lying, creating a story that explains Brennan's disappearance without implicating himself. You think Vance knows more than he's saying? I think Richard Vance spent his career protecting St. Catherine's Hospital from liability. I think he's still doing it, Even now. Sarah pulled out of the driveway. We need to find someone who worked at the hospital in 1987 and knew Thomas Brennan personally. Someone who can tell us what kind of man he really was. Back at the station, Sarah found a message waiting from the DNA lab. The analysis had been expedited given the age of the case and the public interest. Results would be available by the following afternoon. She also found a note from Lieutenant Webb asking her to call him immediately. When she did, his first words were, "We have a problem." What kind of problem? David Whitmore, the son who filed the complaint against Patricia Moorhouse in 1987. He saw the news coverage about the bodies being discovered. He's demanding to speak with the lead detective. He's claiming he has information about what really happened that night. Sarah glanced at Kowalski, who was listening on speakerphone. When does he want to meet? He's downstairs in the lobby right now. Says he won't leave until someone talks to him. Sarah and Kowalski took the elevator down to the first floor. David Whitmore sat in the waiting area, a man in his late 50s, with thinning hair and an expensive suit that suggested his accounting career had been successful. He stood when he saw them approaching, his expression a mixture of grief and anger that looked like it had been held in check for 35 years. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Kowalski. We understand you have information about the case." "I know who killed them," Whitmore said, his voice shaking. "I've known since 1987, but nobody would listen to me. Everyone thought I was just a grieving son making accusations. But I was right. I was always right." Sarah gestured toward the interview rooms. "Let's talk somewhere private." Once they were seated, Sarah pulled out her recorder and placed it on the table. "Mr. Whitmore, before we begin, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded. Do you consent to that?" "Yes. Record everything. I want this on the record." Whitmore leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "My father died at St. Catherine's Hospital in October 1987. The hospital claimed it was complications from heart surgery, but I knew something was wrong. He was recovering well. His doctors were pleased with his progress. Then suddenly, he crashed and died. When I asked questions, I got evasive answers. When I demanded to see his medical records, they gave me incomplete files with pages missing. You filed a complaint against several nurses, including Patricia Moorhouse," Kowalski said, "because they were responsible for his care. Because something happened on their watch that killed my father." Whitmore's voice rose. "I went to the hospital administrator. I went to the police. I went to the medical licensing board. Nobody would investigate properly. They all closed ranks, protected each other." "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said gently, "you said you know who killed the 3 nurses. Who are you referring to?" He looked at her, his eyes haunted. "The hospital administration. They killed those nurses to cover up what really happened to my father. They knew those women could testify about the medication errors, the equipment failures, all the negligence that was happening on the night shift, so they silenced them." Sarah exchanged a glance with Kowalski. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to support it?" "I have this." Whitmore pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "I hired a private investigator in 1988, after the police stopped looking for the nurses. He couldn't find them, but he found this. Financial records showing payments from the hospital's legal defense fund to several offshore accounts. Payments that started right after my father died and continued through 1988. Sarah opened the envelope and found photocopied bank statements and ledger pages. The amounts were substantial, hundreds of thousands of dollars, transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Where did your investigator get these? He had a source inside the hospital's accounting department, someone who believed the hospital was corrupt and wanted the truth to come out. But before my investigator could finish his work, he died. Car accident on Highway 26. Single vehicle crash. No witnesses. They ruled it an accident. But I've never believed that. The room fell silent. Sarah studied the documents, her mind racing through possibilities. If Whitmore was right, if the hospital administration had orchestrated the murders to silence witnesses, then Thomas Brennan might not be the killer at all. He might be another victim, or he might have been paid to disappear and keep quiet about what he'd seen. Mr. Whitmore, I need to keep these documents as evidence. We'll have our forensic accountants review them. Sarah met his eyes, and I promise you, we're going to find out what happened to your father. And to those 3 nurses, whatever the truth is, however far it reaches, we're going to uncover it. The DNA results arrived at 2:17 p.m. the following day. Sarah was at her desk, reviewing David Whitmore's financial documents with a forensic accountant, when her phone buzzed with an email from the lab. She opened it immediately, Kowalski moving to read over her shoulder. The report was technical and dense, but the conclusion was clear. DNA recovered from beneath the fingernails of all 3 victims matched a profile in the national database. The match belonged to a man named Thomas Michael Brennan, whose DNA had been collected during a routine traffic stop in Boise, Idaho, in 2003. We have him, Kowalski said quietly. But Sarah was already reading further, her eyes scanning the additional notes the lab technician had included. Wait, look at this. The DNA under Carmen Reyes's fingernails shows 2 distinct profiles. One matches Brennan. The other is unidentified. Kowalski leaned closer. 2 attackers? Or Brennan had an accomplice. Sarah picked up her phone and called the lab directly. When the technician answered, she said, "This is Detective Chen. I'm looking at your reporting on the St. Catherine's case. Can you tell me anything more about the second DNA profile?" It's male Caucasian, no match in any database, which means either he's never been arrested or his DNA was collected before digital databases became standard. The technician paused. But I can tell you that the sample quality suggests the victim fought hard. She drew blood. Sarah thanked him and ended the call. She turned to Kowalski. Carmen Reyes fought back against someone who isn't in any database. That means someone who's been careful, who's avoided leaving traces, or someone with enough power to make traces disappear, Kowalski said, his expression grim. Sarah's phone rang again. Lieutenant Webb. Chen, we got a hit on the traffic stop from 2003. Boise PD pulled over a Thomas Brennan for a broken taillight. He gave an Idaho driver's license, had current registration, everything checked out. They ran his plates and let him go with a warning. Do we have a current address? The address on the license was an apartment building that's since been demolished. But I've got officers in Boise pulling property records, utility bills, anything that might lead us to him now. Webb paused. Sarah, even if Brennan is our killer, the second DNA profile means we're still missing part of the story. I know. I'm going back through the hospital's employment records. If someone helped Brennan kill those nurses and hide the bodies, they had to have access to the East Wing. After Webb hung up, Sarah spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing every employee who worked at St. Catherine's in 1987 with criminal databases looking for anyone with a history of violence or coercion. She found several employees with minor offenses, drunk driving arrests, domestic disputes, but nothing that suggested involvement in murder. Then Kowalski called her over to his desk. I've been looking at the hospital's security logs from October 23rd. According to the records, the East Wing third-floor security cameras were offline that entire night. Maintenance request filed at 11 p.m. Cameras restored at 6:08 a.m. Who filed the maintenance request? It's not signed. But look at the timestamp. The cameras went offline 15 minutes before the 3 nurses clocked in for their shift. Sarah felt a chill. Someone planned this. They disabled the cameras, waited for the nurses to arrive, then attacked them in a location where there would be no video evidence. And the only person who would have known how to disable the security system and access the maintenance areas was Thomas Brennan. Sarah finished, but he didn't do it alone. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously and found a single line. Richard Vance is lying to you. Check his bank records from November 1987. Sarah showed the message to Kowalski. Someone wants us to investigate Vance. Could be Whitmore, trying to point us toward the hospital conspiracy angle. Or it could be someone who knows the truth and is afraid to come forward directly. Sarah forwarded the message to the forensic accountant she'd been working with. Let's see what Vance's finances looked like in the months after the murders. The response came back within an hour. Richard Vance had received a payment of $75,000 in November 1987, deposited into a personal account separate from his regular salary. The source of the payment was listed as a consulting fee from a medical equipment company that had since gone out of business. Sarah and Kowalski drove back to Lake Oswego as the afternoon light was fading. This time, Elizabeth Vance met them at the door with obvious hostility. My father isn't well enough for more questions. We have evidence that your father received a substantial payment shortly after the murders. We need to ask him about it. Sarah's voice was firm, but not unkind. Miss Vance, if your father has information that could help us solve this case, this is his chance to tell the truth. Elizabeth hesitated, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all. Richard Vance was in the same sunroom, but he looked frailer than he had the day before, as if the weight of decades-old secrets was physically crushing him. He looked up as they entered, and Sarah saw resignation in his eyes. You found the payment, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Who paid you, Mr. Vance? And what was it for? Vance was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a doctor at St. Catherine's, Dr. Marcus Sheridan. He was brilliant, one of the best cardiac surgeons in the state. But he had a problem with prescription medications. He was stealing from the hospital pharmacy, using drugs himself, making mistakes during surgeries. Sarah pulled out her notebook. David Whitmore's father died during heart surgery. Yes, Dr. Sheridan operated on Robert Whitmore. He was impaired during the surgery, made errors. The patient survived the operation, but died 3 days later from complications that were directly related to those errors. Vance's hands trembled. Patricia Moorhouse was the attending nurse. She knew what had happened. So did Carmen Reyes and Denise Fletcher. They came to me, said they were going to report Sheridan to the medical board. And you convinced them not to, Kowalski said. I asked them to wait. Told them the hospital would conduct an internal investigation, that we would handle it appropriately. But they refused. They said patients' lives were at stake, that Sheridan needed to be stopped immediately. Vance closed his eyes. 2 nights later, they were dead. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Did Dr. Sheridan kill them? I don't know. I never asked. I didn't want to know. Vance opened his eyes, and Sarah saw tears. The day after the bodies were discovered missing, Sheridan came to my office. He gave me an envelope with $75,000 in cash and told me that Thomas Brennan had taken care of the problem. He said Brennan owed him a favor, something related to Brennan's time in the military. He told me to make sure the investigation didn't look too closely at either of them. And you agreed, Sarah said, not bothering to hide her disgust. I was protecting the hospital? That's what I told myself. If the truth came out, St. Catherine's would have been destroyed. Lawsuits, criminal investigations, loss of accreditation. Hundreds of employees would have lost their jobs. Thousands of patients would have lost their hospital. Vance's voice broke. I thought I was making an impossible choice for the greater good. But I know now I was just a coward who let 3 women die unavenged. Where is Dr. Sheridan now? Kowalski asked. He died in 1995. Overdose. They ruled it accidental. But I always wondered if it was suicide, if the guilt finally caught up to him. Sarah stood, her mind already moving to the next steps. Mr. Vance, you'll need to make a formal statement. Everything you've told us, on the record. I know. I'm ready. He looked at his daughter, who stood pale and horrified in the doorway. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'm sorry for all of it. Outside, in the gathering dusk, Sarah and Kowalski sat in their car. Sheridan ordered the murders, Kowalski said. Brennan carried them out. Vance covered it up. And somewhere in Boise, Idaho, Thomas Brennan is living under a new identity, thinking he got away with it. Sarah started the engine. Not anymore. Her phone rang. Lieutenant Webb. We found him. Boise PD located Thomas Brennan. He's been living under the name Thomas Bradley, working as a custodian at a community college. They're picking him up now. He'll be extradited to Portland within 48 hours. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, mixed with something darker. Good. I want to be there when he arrives. I want to look him in the eye when we charge him. You've earned it, Chen. This case, you did what none of us could do for 35 years. You brought those women home. But as Sarah drove away from the Vance house, she couldn't shake the image of those scratch marks on the wall. 3 women had died, but someone had survived long enough to claw at the plaster. Someone whose body wasn't behind the wall when the construction crew broke through. The 4th victim, she said aloud. Kowalski looked at her. What? The scratch marks. Dr. Morrison said none of the 3 nurses could have made them. So, who did? Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, her mind racing. What if there was someone else, sealed in that space? Someone who survived longer than the others, who managed to escape, or whose body was removed? Or, Kowalski said slowly, what if someone was sealed in there alive, as punishment or insurance, and Brennan came back later to retrieve them? Sarah pulled out her phone and called Dr. Morrison. When the medical examiner answered, Sarah said, the sealed space where the bodies were found. Was there room for a 4th person? Possibly. The space was approximately 4 feet by 8 feet. 3 bodies were positioned side by side, but there would have been space above them or at their feet for another person, especially a smaller person. A child? Yes, a child could have fit. Dr. Morrison paused. Detective, what are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to know every one of us who went missing from St. Catherine's Hospital in October 1987. Not just the 3 nurses, everyone. Thomas Brennan sat in the interrogation room at Portland Police Department headquarters, his wrists shackled to the table, his face showing none of the fear or remorse Sarah had expected. He was 73 years old now, his hair white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes remained alert and calculating. Sarah sat across from him, a thick file folder between them, Kowalski standing against the wall behind her. The recorder was running, the camera documenting everything. Mr. Brennan, you've been read your rights, and you've declined an attorney. Is that correct? That's correct. His voice was steady, almost bored. I don't need a lawyer. I've been waiting for this day for 35 years. You've been waiting to be caught. I've been waiting to tell the truth. Brennan leaned back in his chair, as much as the shackles allowed. Dr. Marcus Sheridan ordered me to kill Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher. He told me they were going to destroy everything, ruin his career, close the hospital. He said it was them or hundreds of innocent patients who depended on St. Catherine's. And you believed him? I believed I owed him. He saved my life in Vietnam. We served together. He was a medic. When I came back, when the PTSD got bad, he got me into treatment, helped me find work. When he asked me to repay that debt, I couldn't refuse. Sarah opened the file folder and pulled out crime scene photographs. You beat 3 women to death with a pipe wrench we found in the walls. You sealed them in a space where they would never be found. That's how you repaid your debt. For the first time, something flickered in Brennan's expression. Regret, perhaps, or shame. I killed Patricia first. She fought, scratched my face. Then Carmen came looking for her, and I had to kill her too. Denise tried to run, made it to the stairwell, but I caught her. He looked down at his shackled hands. I sealed them in the maintenance space and rebuilt the wall. It took me 4 hours. Nobody came to that section of the floor. Nobody knew. Except Dr. Sheridan and Richard Vance. Sheridan paid Vance to protect us both. Vance arranged for me to leave Portland, set me up with a new identity. I've been Thomas Bradley ever since. Sarah laid another photograph on the table. There were scratch marks on the interior wall of that space, deep gouges made by fingernails. But Dr. Morrison determined that none of the 3 nurses could have made those marks. They were already dead when you sealed them in. So who made them, Mr. Brennan? The mask of calm finally cracked. Brennan's face went pale, and his hands began to shake. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think there was a 4th person in that space. Someone who survived longer than the others. Someone you either killed later or let escape. Sarah leaned forward. Tell me who it was. Brennan was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Patricia's daughter, Jennifer. She'd come to the hospital that night of a surprise visit to bring her mother dinner. She saw everything, saw me kill her mother. I couldn't let her tell anyone. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Jennifer Moorhouse is alive. I interviewed her 2 days ago. Not Jennifer Moorhouse, Jennifer Holloway. Patricia's daughter from a previous relationship before she married. A daughter nobody knew about because Patricia had given her up for adoption when she was 16. Brennan looked up, his eyes haunted. She was 10 years old when I sealed her in that space. But I couldn't kill a child. Couldn't do it. So I came back 3 hours later, after my shift ended. I broke through the wall and pulled her out. She was barely conscious, dehydrated, terrified. What did you do with her? I drove her to Seattle and left her at a hospital emergency room. Told the nurse I'd found her wandering on the highway, that she seemed confused and couldn't tell me her name. Then, I disappeared. Brennan's voice broke. I've lived with that choice every day since. I should have turned myself in then, should have told the truth. But I was a coward. Sarah and Kowalski exchanged glances. If Brennan was telling the truth, there was a woman somewhere, now 45 years old, who had witnessed her biological mother's murder and had survived being sealed in a wall. A woman who might not even remember what happened to her, who might have blocked out the trauma entirely. Do you know what name she was using? Any information about the adoption? Patricia told me once, in confidence. She said her daughter had been adopted by a family named Holloway in Eugene. She said the girl's new name was Rebecca. That's all I know. Sarah stood. Thomas Brennan, you're being charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You'll be held without bail pending trial. As officers led Brennan away, Sarah turned to Kowalski. We need to find Rebecca Holloway. It took 2 weeks of searching, cross-referencing adoption records and hospital admissions from October 1987. But they finally located her. Rebecca Holloway, now Rebecca Chen, no relation to Sarah, living in Vancouver, Washington, married with 2 children, working as a school librarian. Sarah drove to Vancouver on a gray November morning and knocked on the door of a modest house with a well-tended garden. The woman who answered was in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that faded when she saw Sarah's badge. Rebecca Chen? Yes. I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Portland Police Department. I need to talk to you about something that happened when you were 10 years old, something you may not remember. Rebecca's face went pale. The hospital? I've had dreams about it my whole life. Dark spaces scratching at walls, voices. My therapist says they're just nightmares, trauma from being abandoned on the highway when I was a child. But they feel like memories. They are memories, Sarah said gently. May I come in? They sat in Rebecca's living room, and Sarah told her everything. About Patricia Moorhouse, the biological mother Rebecca had never known. About the 3 nurses who had been murdered trying to protect patients. About Thomas Brennan and Dr. Sheridan, and the conspiracy that had kept the truth buried for 35 years. Rebecca cried, her hands trembling, as Sarah showed her photographs of Patricia. She gave me up because she was 16 and alone. But she never stopped thinking about me, never stopped loving me. And when I came to see her that night, to surprise her, I walked into a nightmare. You survived because you were strong, and because a part of Thomas Brennan couldn't kill a child, even after everything else he'd done. What happens now? Brennan will go to trial. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Richard Vance has agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced charges. And you, Sarah paused, you get to decide how much of this story you want to claim as your own. Rebecca looked at the photographs of Patricia Moorhouse, at the young woman with dark hair and warm eyes who had given her life. I want people to know who she was. I want people to know that she tried to do the right thing and that it cost her everything. She deserves to be remembered. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, a memorial was unveiled outside the site where St. Catherine's Hospital had once stood. The building had been demolished, replaced by a park with walking paths and benches. The memorial was simple, 3 bronze plaques bearing the names Patricia Moorhouse, Carmen Reyes, and Denise Fletcher, with the inscription, "In memory of 3 nurses who gave their lives protecting those in their care." Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, standing at the back of the crowd as family members spoke, as colleagues from 1987 shared their memories, as Rebecca Chen laid flowers at the memorial and spoke publicly for the first time about the mother she had never known but would never forget. Justice had taken 35 years, but it had finally arrived. 3 women who had been erased, hidden, forgotten, were now remembered and honored. Their story, once sealed behind a wall, was now told openly, a reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and that truth, however delayed, eventually finds its way into the light. As Sarah walked back to her car, her phone buzzed with a new case assignment. Another cold case, another set of families waiting for answers. She opened the file and began to read, ready to do for them what she had done for Patricia, Carmen, and Denise. Because the dead deserved justice, no matter how long they had to wait.